George Washington, by the time of the Newburgh Conspiracy in 1783, had already established himself as the defining figure of the American Revolution. His leadership, from the early days of military struggle to the eventual triumph at Yorktown, had earned him the admiration of both his peers and the public. Yet, this same man, who had become a symbol of liberty, was about to face one of the most challenging dilemmas of his career: how to manage a restless and increasingly disillusioned army, while also safeguarding the principles of democracy that he had fought for. This chapter sets the stage for the pivotal moment in American history, one that could have altered the future of the new republic forever, had it not been for Washington's unique sense of honor and duty. In the early months of 1783, the Revolutionary War had effectively ended. The Treaty of Paris was on the horizon, and America's victory over Great Britain was all but secured. However, this victory did little to resolve the internal problems faced by the fledgling nation. The Continental Army, which had endured years of hardship under Washington's leadership, was now left in a state of uncertainty. Soldiers had not been paid for months, their families were suffering, and the promise of land and pensions seemed more distant with each passing day. The morale of the army was at an all-time low, and frustration began to boil over. Washington's soldiers, having fought for freedom and independence, were now questioning whether the government they had helped create could live up to its promises. The government of the Confederation, operating under the Articles of Confederation, was a weak and inefficient body that struggled to raise funds, regulate commerce, or enforce laws. It had no executive authority and no real ability to govern effectively. Worse still, it could not fulfill its obligations to the soldiers who had given so much for the cause of independence. This led to growing unrest within the ranks of the Continental Army, and whispers of rebellion began to circulate. Soldiers, many of whom had been part of Washington's army since the very beginning of the war, now found themselves faced with the prospect of a future without the support or recognition they had been promised. The tension reached its breaking point when, in the winter of 1783, a group of officers at Newburgh, New York, began to plot a drastic course of action. The officers, led by the charismatic and ambitious Major John Armstrong, were frustrated by the lack of financial support from the government and the general disarray of the post-war situation. They saw Washington as the only person who could potentially stabilize the nation, but they were also beginning to entertain darker thoughts about the future of the new country. Some of them, particularly Armstrong, saw an opportunity to elevate Washington to a position of unparalleled power, even suggesting that he might become a monarch or king. Others, less idealistic, simply sought to secure their own future and hoped to force the hand of Congress by threatening to march on the Capitol. In the midst of this discontent, Washington was fully aware of the brewing discontent among his men. He had always been a man who placed duty above all else, but now he faced an unprecedented challenge. The loyalty of his soldiers was undiminished, but they were growing impatient, and Washington could not ignore their anger. Yet, he also understood the fragile nature of the new republic and the delicate balance of power that had been established. He was not blind to the fact that, in times of crisis, men like him could easily be swept up in the tides of power, and that a leader who grew too powerful could become a tyrant. Washington had always been guided by a sense of honor and duty, and he was determined not to allow the army's dissatisfaction to turn into something that would undermine the very foundation of the government he had fought to create. In this tense atmosphere, Washington called a meeting of the officers at Newburgh to address their grievances. It was a delicate moment for him, as he needed to balance the demands of his soldiers with a broader vision of the republic. The officers had been meeting in secret, and rumors of their plans had already reached Washington's ears. As the officers gathered in the room, Washington stood before them, fully aware that their loyalty was now in question. The fate of the country and of his own legacy hung in the balance. He could have easily played to their frustrations, offered them more power, or even promised them a future of wealth and status. But instead, he chose to address them directly, acknowledging their suffering but also reminding them of the ideals for which they had fought. The speech he delivered that day in Newburgh would become one of the defining moments of his leadership. Washington did not offer empty promises or invoke the language of vengeance. Instead, he appealed to their sense of duty and honor. He reminded the officers of the cause they had fought for, the ideals of liberty and democracy that they had all sworn to uphold. He spoke not just as their commander, but as a fellow patriot who had suffered alongside them. He understood their pain, their frustrations, and their sacrifices, but he also knew that their actions in this moment would determine the future of the Republic. Washington warned them of the dangers of disunity and factionalism, reminding them that the survival of the nation depended on the preservation of its principles. The Republic, he said, could not survive if those who had fought for it resorted to violence or sedition. The emotional weight of his words was palpable, and as he finished speaking, the room fell silent. Washington's appeal to their sense of honor and patriotism struck a chord with the officers, many of whom had been on the verge of rebellion. The mood shifted, and what could have been the beginning of a military coup instead became a reaffirmation of Washington's leadership. The officers, having been reminded of their higher duty, agreed to cease their plans for revolt. Washington had not only averted a crisis within his own army, but had also saved the fledgling nation from the brink of anarchy. The Newburgh Conspiracy, though small in its immediate scope, had enormous implications for the future of the United States. Washington's handling of the crisis not only cemented his reputation as the leader of the revolution, but also demonstrated the power of character and principle in times of national turmoil. In a moment when the survival of the Republic could have been jeopardized by the very men who had fought to create it, Washington's unwavering commitment to the ideals of liberty, democracy, and republicanism guided the nation through its most dangerous moment. This chapter sets the stage for understanding the magnitude of Washington's leadership. It shows that despite his status as a national hero, he faced the same temptations for power that many of the world's greatest leaders had succumbed to. Yet, Washington's refusal to pursue personal ambition, his commitment to democracy, and his deep sense of duty to the nation allowed him to make the right choice. He chose not to seize power, but to return it to the people, preserving the delicate balance of authority that had been the foundation of the revolution. This moment, which could have marked the beginning of an American monarchy, instead marked the continuation of a republic founded on the principles of freedom and self-governance. As the dust settled from the Newburgh Conspiracy, George Washington found himself at the crossroads of history. The immediate threat of rebellion among his officers had been quelled, but the underlying issues facing the young republic were far from resolved. Washington's leadership had averted a potential crisis, but the nation was still fragile, its future uncertain. The Treaty of Paris had ended the Revolutionary War, and the United States had achieved independence, but had not yet secured a stable government. The promises made to soldiers, who had fought for years without pay, remained unfulfilled. The Articles of Confederation, the document that served as the nation's first constitution, had proven inadequate in addressing the growing needs of a post-war nation. Washington's success on the battlefield had made him the unquestioned hero of the revolution. But now, as the country's first president, he would face a much greater challenge, uniting a fractured nation under a government that was still in its infancy. The nation, in the immediate aftermath of the war, was a patchwork of different interests, ideologies, and regional loyalties. The colonies had fought together for a common cause, but they were far from unified in their vision for the future. The economy was in shambles, with war debts piling up and trade disrupted. The federal government, under the Articles of Confederation, had no real power to tax, regulate commerce, or enforce laws. Each state, meanwhile, was pursuing its own interests, with some establishing their own currencies and others imposing tariffs on goods coming from neighboring states. Washington was painfully aware that unless something changed, the fragile union of states could easily fall apart. The specter of anarchy loomed over the country, and the very ideals of liberty that had spurred the revolution were now at risk of being overshadowed by disorder and division. Washington's first challenge, as he took office, was to navigate these turbulent waters. He had long been a proponent of a strong, centralized government, but he was also deeply committed to the principles of republicanism that had defined the revolution. The delicate balance between authority and liberty was something he had always struggled with. And now, as president, he would have to find a way to forge a path that would unify the nation without sacrificing the freedoms that had been so hard-won. It was a daunting task, and Washington knew that failure was not an option. The survival of the Republic depended on his ability to maintain stability and to build trust among the American people. One of the first steps Washington took was to assemble a cabinet that would help him navigate the complex political landscape. He understood that his presidency would be defined by the decisions he made in these early years, and he needed the counsel of wise and capable men. He chose Thomas Jefferson as his Secretary of State, a man who shared his vision for a strong republic but differed on how to achieve it. Jefferson was a champion of states' rights and agrarianism, believing that the future of America lay in its rural, decentralized roots. In contrast, Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, was a firm believer in a strong central government and an economy based on commerce and industry. Hamilton's vision for the nation was one of a robust federal government with the power to manage the economy and establish a strong financial system. These two men, though they disagreed on many issues, would become the central figures in shaping the policies of the new government. Their rivalry would define much of Washington's presidency, but Washington, ever the pragmatist, saw their differences as a strength. He believed that a balance of competing ideas would help forge a path that was both practical and visionary. Washington's most immediate concern was the nation's finances. The Revolutionary War had left the country deeply in debt, and the government had no means of raising revenue. The Continental Congress had issued paper money during the war, but had lost much of its value, and the government's creditors were demanding payment. Washington recognized that if the new government was to be taken seriously, it had to address its financial situation head-on. Hamilton, with his background in finance, was the perfect man to tackle this challenge. He proposed a bold plan to assume the state debts, create a national bank, and establish a system of tariffs to raise revenue. Hamilton's plan was controversial, particularly among those who feared the concentration of power in a strong federal government, but Washington supported it. He understood that a strong financial system was crucial to the success of the Republic, and he trusted Hamilton's vision. At the same time, Washington faced a growing crisis on the western frontier. The United States, having won its independence from Britain, now had to contend with Native American tribes who were determined to defend their land. The Treaty of Paris had granted the United States control over vast territories, but this land was not uninhabited. Native American tribes, particularly in the Ohio River Valley, saw the new American government as just another colonial power that sought to displace them. Washington was keenly aware of the delicate nature of these relations. He did not want to repeat the mistakes of the British, who had waged brutal wars against Native Americans in their quest for control over the continent. At the same time, Washington understood that the expansion of American territory was essential to the nation's survival and prosperity. In the face of this growing conflict, Washington took a cautious but firm approach. He sought to balance the interests of settlers moving westward with the rights of Native Americans. He dispatched military forces to protect American settlements and tried to negotiate peaceful treaties with the tribes. However, these efforts were largely unsuccessful, and the conflict continued to escalate throughout his presidency. Washington's handling of Native American relations would set a precedent for future presidents, and his legacy in this regard remains a subject of debate. While he sought peace, his policies also laid the groundwork for the eventual forced removal of Native Americans from their lands in the 19th century. At the same time, Washington was becoming increasingly concerned about the growing divisions within the country. The political parties that had begun to emerge during the early years of the Republic were more than just ideological differences. They represented deep regional and social divides. The tensions between Jefferson's agrarian vision and Hamilton's commercial vision reflected broader debates about the future of the nation. The question of whether the United States would be a nation of farmers and states' rights or a nation of industry and federal power was not just an academic one. It had real implications for how the government would function and who would hold power. Washington, though sympathetic to many of Jefferson's views, was deeply wary of the dangers of factionalism. He feared that political parties would divide the nation and undermine the republic he had fought to create. In his farewell address, Washington would famously warn against the perils of political parties and foreign alliances, urging the nation to avoid entanglements that could drag it into unnecessary conflicts. This was his vision for the republic, a nation united by a common purpose, free from the divisions that had torn apart Europe. Yet despite his warnings, the divide between Hamilton and Jefferson continued to grow, and political parties began to take shape. The Federalists, led by Hamilton, championed a strong central government, a strong military, and an economy based on commerce and industry. The Republicans, led by Jefferson, advocated for a limited federal government, a strict interpretation of the Constitution, and an agrarian economy. These two factions would come to define American politics for generations to come, and their rivalry would continue to shape the direction of the nation. In this environment of growing political division, Washington faced the ongoing challenge of keeping the country united. His presidency was marked by the constant tension between competing visions of what America should become. As the first president of the United States, Washington understood that the success or failure of the nation would depend on the decisions made during these early years. The foundations of the republic were being laid, and Washington was determined to ensure that those foundations were strong enough to support the future of the country. Washington's second term was defined by these struggles: financial, political, and military. He had led the country through the war for independence, and now he faced the challenge of leading it through the difficult and uncertain years that followed. The republic was still in its infancy, and its future was far from guaranteed. But Washington's steady hand, his commitment to the ideals of the Revolution, and his ability to navigate the complex political landscape allowed the country to survive these early trials. His leadership, though at times controversial and divisive, ensured that the United States remained a unified republic, poised to grow and evolve in the years to come. The challenges of his presidency laid the groundwork for the future of the nation, and Washington's legacy as the father of the American Republic was secured. In the early years of Washington's presidency, the weight of his leadership was felt most acutely in the challenges that emerged on the international stage. Despite the success of the Revolutionary War and the formal recognition of the United States by European powers, the young nation was far from secure in its place among the world's great powers. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 had ended the war, but it had also left unresolved questions about America's borders, its relationships with European powers, and its ability to navigate the delicate balance between maintaining its sovereignty and engaging with foreign nations. Washington, ever the pragmatist, knew that the survival of the republic depended not only on strong leadership at home, but also on the country's ability to establish itself as a credible and respected force in international affairs. One of Washington's first and most pressing concerns was the issue of relations with Great Britain. Though the British had formally acknowledged American independence in the Treaty of Paris, the relationship between the two nations remained tense. The British still held several key forts in the American Midwest, a source of friction between the two countries. Furthermore, British trade restrictions on American goods and the continued presence of British military personnel in North America were a constant reminder of the unresolved issues left in the wake of the Revolution. Washington understood that, despite the victory in the war, the United States was still vulnerable to British influence. He believed that a strong and diplomatic approach was necessary to prevent further conflict and to secure the country's position in the world. To this end, Washington appointed John Jay, one of the architects of the Treaty of Paris, as the first Chief Justice of the United States. Jay, a seasoned diplomat, was tasked with the delicate responsibility of managing relations with Britain. Under Washington's leadership, Jay negotiated the Jay Treaty in 1794, which sought to resolve many of the outstanding issues between the United States and Great Britain. The treaty addressed British fortifications on American soil, trade disputes, and the debts owed by both nations. While the treaty was seen as a necessary step toward avoiding war, it was deeply unpopular among certain factions of the American public, particularly those who supported France in the ongoing wars between Britain and France. The treaty's provisions, which many viewed as favorable to Britain, sparked heated debate and political division within the country. Washington's support for the Jay Treaty, despite its unpopularity, highlighted his deep commitment to the long-term stability of the nation. He believed that peace with Britain was essential to securing the fledgling republic's survival. The treaty, while controversial, helped to stabilize relations with Britain, and it allowed the United States to focus on other pressing matters, including its relationship with France, which was undergoing its own revolution at the time. Washington's decision to support the treaty, even at the cost of political capital, was a clear demonstration of his pragmatic approach to foreign policy. He understood that the survival of the United States required careful diplomacy and that, at times, it was necessary to make difficult decisions for the greater good of the nation. Simultaneously, Washington faced the challenge of managing the growing tensions between the United States and France. The French Revolution, which had erupted in 1789, was seen by many in America as the continuation of the struggle for liberty that had begun in the United States. However, as the revolution grew more radical, the situation became more complex. The United States had originally sympathized with the French cause, but as the revolution descended into violence, particularly with the execution of King Louis XVI in 1793, Washington's administration found itself in a difficult position. On one hand, there was a strong popular sentiment in the United States in favor of the French Revolution, particularly among the Democratic-Republican faction led by Thomas Jefferson. On the other hand, the increasing instability of the French government and its subsequent declaration of war against Britain created a diplomatic crisis for Washington. In response to the French Revolution and the subsequent outbreak of war between France and Britain, Washington issued the Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793. The proclamation declared that the United States would remain neutral in the conflict between the two European powers, a decision that would have lasting implications for American foreign policy. Washington's neutrality policy was rooted in the belief that the United States, as a young and relatively weak nation, could not afford to become entangled in the wars of Europe. He feared that such involvement would only lead to further instability and potentially jeopardize the fragile unity that had been achieved after the Revolution. The proclamation was met with mixed reactions. Many in the country, particularly those sympathetic to France, were outraged by Washington's refusal to support the French, while others, particularly the Federalists, supported his decision to prioritize American interests above those of foreign powers. The Proclamation of Neutrality was one of Washington's most significant foreign policy decisions, and it set the tone for the United States' approach to international relations for many years to come. Washington understood that the United States was not yet strong enough to intervene in European conflicts and that the nation's survival depended on focusing on its own development. By remaining neutral, Washington sought to avoid unnecessary entanglements and preserve the country's independence. This policy of neutrality would become a cornerstone of American foreign policy for much of the 19th century, and it reflected Washington's belief in the importance of safeguarding the Republic from the dangers of foreign entanglements. Washington's foreign policy was not without its challenges. However, one of the most significant obstacles he faced was the question of American expansion. The Treaty of Paris had granted the United States vast new territories, but these lands were not without their challenges. Native American tribes, particularly in the Ohio River Valley and the Great Lakes region, resisted American encroachment on their lands, and Washington's government was forced to contend with this ongoing conflict. The United States had to navigate complex negotiations with Native American tribes while also managing the interests of settlers who sought to expand westward. Washington's approach to this issue was one of caution and negotiation. He recognized the importance of protecting American settlers while also respecting the sovereignty of Native American tribes. At times, this balance was difficult to maintain, and the United States engaged in a series of military campaigns against Native American forces. However, Washington's efforts to negotiate peaceful solutions were a reflection of his belief in the importance of maintaining the country's moral standing on the world stage. Washington's presidency was marked by these complex foreign policy challenges, and his approach to diplomacy was shaped by a combination of pragmatism, caution, and a deep commitment to the long-term success of the United States. His handling of relations with Britain, France, and Native American tribes laid the foundation for American foreign policy in the years that followed. Washington understood that the United States' survival depended on its ability to maintain peace and stability at home while navigating the complex and often hostile world of international relations. His decision to remain neutral in the conflict between Britain and France, while controversial at the time, was a testament to his foresight and his understanding of the limitations of American power. As Washington's second term neared its end, the challenges of foreign policy would continue to shape his presidency. The political divisions within the United States, particularly between the Federalists and Democratic Republicans, were beginning to deepen, and these divisions would soon spill over into the realm of foreign policy. Yet, despite the political turbulence of his administration, Washington's foreign policy legacy remained one of stability and pragmatism. His careful management of the nation's relationships with foreign powers, his commitment to neutrality, and his focus on American independence set the stage for the United States to emerge as a respected and powerful nation in the years to come. Washington's approach to foreign policy was marked by a commitment to the principles of republicanism and a recognition of the need for caution and diplomacy in an often unpredictable world. In the end, his leadership during this critical period of American history ensured that the Republic would survive its infancy and begin to carve out its place in the world. By the time George Washington began his second term in office, the political landscape of the United States had shifted dramatically. The nation had begun to mature, but was also becoming more divided, with a clear rift forming between two emerging political factions. These factions, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, were not merely groups of people with differing views on policy. They represented competing visions for the future of the Republic. At the heart of this divide was a question that would continue to shape the country's development for generations. What kind of nation should the United States be? The Federalists, led by figures like Alexander Hamilton, believed in a strong central government, a robust military, and an economy based on commerce and industry. They saw the United States as a growing power that needed a solid financial system, a central bank, and a strong industrial base to compete on the world stage. Hamilton, in particular, was keen to establish a national bank, a system of public credit, and tariffs that would protect American industries. These ideas were rooted in the belief that the federal government should have the authority to shape the economy and ensure the long-term stability of the nation. The Federalists were generally supported by merchants, bankers, and those living in urban areas who stood to benefit from a strong central government and an economy based on trade. In contrast, the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, believed that power should remain in the hands of the states and that the federal government should be limited in its reach. They were wary of a powerful central government, fearing that it could become tyrannical and infringe on the rights of the people. The Democratic Republicans were also staunch supporters of agrarianism, the idea that the nation's strength lay in its farmers and rural areas, not in the development of industry and commerce. They believed that the United States should remain a nation of small farmers, not large cities or factories. For them, the ideal republic was one where individual liberty was safeguarded and where citizens had the ability to govern themselves without the interference of a distant and powerful central government. As Washington navigated the increasingly partisan landscape, he found himself caught between these two competing visions. On one hand, he shared many of the Federalist views on the importance of a strong central government, particularly when it came to issues like the nation's finances and military strength. He saw the need for a national bank and a strong financial system, and he understood the importance of maintaining a solid relationship with European powers, particularly Great Britain. On the other hand, Washington also understood the value of the agrarian ideal, and he was wary of the dangers of too much centralized power. He had long believed that the success of the American experiment depended on the preservation of individual rights and the ability of states to govern themselves. Despite his sympathies toward both factions, Washington was determined to avoid the dangers of factionalism that had plagued many European nations. He feared that the rise of political parties would divide the nation and undermine the very foundations of the republic. In his farewell address, Washington would famously warn against the dangers of political parties and foreign alliances, urging the nation to avoid entanglements that could drag it into unnecessary conflicts. His desire to maintain unity and stability in the face of growing division was a testament to his commitment to the principles of the Revolution and the long-term success of the Republic. The divisions within the nation were not merely theoretical. They had real consequences, especially in the realm of foreign policy. The issue of foreign alliances, in particular, had become a point of contention. The United States, having recently emerged from its own revolution, was deeply sympathetic to the French Revolution and its ideals of liberty. However, as the French Revolution descended into chaos and violence, with the execution of King Louis XVI in 1793, Washington found himself caught in a difficult position. The United States had signed a treaty with France during the Revolution, and many Americans felt an obligation to support France in its war against Britain. On the other hand, Washington was acutely aware of the dangers of becoming entangled in the European conflicts. The United States was a young and relatively weak nation, and its survival depended on maintaining peace and avoiding war with the great powers of Europe. Washington's response to the French Revolution and its aftermath was to issue the Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793, a move that was highly controversial at the time. The proclamation declared that the United States would remain neutral in the conflict between France and Britain, effectively cutting ties with France and its revolutionary government. While this decision was deeply unpopular among many Americans, particularly those who sympathized with France, Washington believed it was the only way to ensure the survival of the Republic. By remaining neutral, the United States could avoid being drawn into a war that it could not afford to fight, and it could focus on strengthening its own government and economy. The Proclamation of Neutrality marked a defining moment in Washington's presidency. It set the tone for American foreign policy for many years to come, establishing the principle of neutrality as a cornerstone of the nation's diplomatic strategy. Washington's decision to avoid entanglement in European wars was rooted in his belief that the United States was not yet strong enough to compete on the world stage, and that its interests would be better served by remaining independent of European conflicts. This policy of neutrality would continue to shape American foreign policy for much of the 19th century, as successive presidents sought to avoid the conflicts that plagued Europe. The decision to maintain neutrality was not without its challenges. In 1794, Washington faced a new crisis with the outbreak of the Whiskey Rebellion in western Pennsylvania. The rebellion was sparked by a federal excise tax on whiskey, which had been enacted to help pay off the national debt. Farmers in western Pennsylvania, many of whom relied on whiskey production as a source of income, saw the tax as unfair and burdensome. When protests turned into violent uprisings, Washington was forced to send federal troops to quell the rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion was significant not only because of the threat it posed to the federal government's authority, but also because it marked the first major test of the new government's ability to enforce its laws. Washington's handling of the rebellion demonstrated his commitment to maintaining order and upholding the authority of the federal government, even in the face of popular dissent. Despite the challenges he faced, Washington's leadership during his second term helped to solidify the foundations of the new republic. He worked tirelessly to strengthen the nation's financial system, expand its infrastructure, and establish a strong central government. His leadership was marked by a steady hand and a commitment to the principles of republicanism, even as the political divisions within the country deepened. Washington was keenly aware of the challenges ahead, but he remained determined to guide the nation through these turbulent years. In the final years of his presidency, Washington faced the increasing polarization of American politics. The Federalist and Democratic-Republican factions had become more entrenched, and the political landscape was becoming more contentious. Washington had hoped that the country could avoid the dangers of political parties, but the rise of partisan politics seemed inevitable. Still, Washington's leadership during this period set a lasting precedent for future presidents. He understood the importance of compromise, diplomacy, and stability, and his example would guide the nation in the years to come. Washington's second term marked the end of an era. By the time he left office in 1797, the United States had grown stronger, more united, and more secure in its place in the world. Washington's decision to step down from the presidency after 2 terms was a monumental act in itself, as it established a precedent for future presidents and reinforced the principles of republicanism. He could have easily sought more power, but he chose to relinquish it, demonstrating his deep commitment to the ideals of the Revolution. Washington's leadership had ensured that the United States would survive its infancy and embark on the long road toward becoming the nation it would eventually become. His presidency, though marked by challenges and divisions, ultimately laid the foundation for the Republic's future success. As George Washington's second term as president drew to a close, the fledgling United States found itself in a period of transition. The Republic, which had been born out of revolution and founded on the ideals of liberty and self-governance, was still finding its way. The political environment had shifted considerably during Washington's time in office, as the country's first political parties began to take shape, most notably between the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson. These ideological divisions would continue to shape the nation for decades. But the immediate issue at hand was the survival and strengthening of the young republic itself. Washington, having successfully guided the nation through the initial struggles of establishing a government, now faced the task of leaving behind a framework for future leaders to follow. His decision to step down after 2 terms, setting a precedent for the peaceful transfer of power, was one of the most significant moments in American history. Washington's refusal to seek a 3rd term, despite his immense popularity, solidified the principles of republicanism and self-rule, reinforcing the idea that no one individual, no matter how revered, should have unchecked power over the nation. As Washington prepared to retire from public life, the United States was still a nation in its infancy, and there were many questions left unanswered. The economic system was still fragile, the federal government had limited power, and political factionalism was on the rise. Washington's farewell address, delivered in 1796, would become a defining document in American political thought, and it offered his final guidance to the nation he had helped to create. His address, though deeply reflective, also contained warnings and advice for the generations to come, advice that would prove prescient in the years ahead. In his farewell address, Washington's primary concern was the future stability of the Republic. He warned against the dangers of political parties, which he believed would divide the nation and create factions that would undermine the common good. The rise of political parties, he argued, was a direct threat to the unity of the nation, and he urged Americans to avoid the entanglements of partisan politics. Washington saw the emergence of the Federalist and Democratic-Republican parties as a potential source of disunity, and he feared that the personal interests of party leaders would overshadow the broader national interest. The common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of party, Washington wrote, are sufficient to make it the interest and duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it. Washington's concerns about factionalism were not unfounded. By the time of his departure, the political landscape of the United States had already begun to show signs of deepening divisions. The Federalists, led by Hamilton, advocated for a strong central government and a robust financial system, while the Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson and Madison, favored a more decentralized government with greater emphasis on states' rights. These ideological differences were not just matters of policy, they were matters of principle. For the Federalists, the future of the United States lay in a strong central government that could provide the stability necessary for economic growth and national security. For the Democratic Republicans, the ideal of a nation of small farmers and limited government was essential to preserving individual liberty and preventing tyranny. The tensions between these 2 factions were becoming increasingly pronounced during Washington's second term, and they were on full display in the debates over the Jay Treaty, the establishment of a national bank, and foreign policy. Hamilton's vision for the United States was one of a strong, centralized state with the power to regulate commerce, manage finances, and assert itself on the world stage. Jefferson, on the other hand, feared that such power would lead to the erosion of individual rights and the concentration of too much authority in the hands of the federal government. These ideological clashes formed the basis for the political parties that would define the next generation of American politics. Washington's warnings about factionalism were not just political in nature. They were also deeply personal. Washington, who had spent much of his life in the service of his country, was acutely aware of the dangers of ambition and self-interest. Throughout his career, he had resisted the lure of personal power, always putting the interests of the nation first. His voluntary decision to step down from the presidency was a powerful statement of his commitment to Republican ideals and the belief that no one man should hold too much power. Washington's decision to retire after 2 terms was, in many ways, a lesson in self-restraint and humility, and it set a precedent that would shape the presidency for generations to come. Another key element of Washington's farewell address was his advice on foreign policy. Washington, having navigated the delicate early years of American diplomacy, recognized the importance of maintaining neutrality in the world's conflicts. The United States, he believed, was still too young and vulnerable to become involved in the complex and often dangerous politics of Europe. Washington's policy of neutrality was a cornerstone of his foreign policy throughout his presidency, and he cautioned future generations to avoid the pitfalls of entangling alliances. It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world, Washington wrote, taking care always to keep ourselves by suitable establishments on a respectable defensive posture. This advice was rooted in Washington's belief that the United States needed to focus on its own development and security before engaging in foreign conflicts. The nation had only recently emerged from the Revolutionary War, and Washington understood that the United States had not yet attained the strength or influence to challenge the great European powers. The dangers of foreign entanglements, he argued, were manifold. They could drag the United States into unnecessary wars, drain its resources, and disrupt the fragile unity of a young republic. Washington's vision for the United States was one of independence, an independent nation that could chart its own course in the world without being beholden to the interests of foreign powers. At the same time, Washington also recognized the importance of maintaining peace and establishing friendly relations with other nations. While he urged the United States to avoid alliances, he did not call for isolationism. He understood that the United States needed to engage with the world on its own terms, building trade relations and diplomatic ties with nations that shared its interests. Washington's foreign policy was based on the idea of strategic diplomacy, picking and choosing when to engage and when to stay out of foreign conflicts. His advice in the farewell address was to remain vigilant, maintaining a strong military and diplomatic posture, but to avoid becoming embroiled in the struggles of Europe. As Washington prepared to leave office, his legacy was already beginning to take shape. The nation had weathered the storm of revolution, established a stable government, and secured its independence on the global stage. The framework for the nation's future was in place, and Washington had played an essential role in ensuring that the United States would survive and thrive. However, the challenges facing the young republic were far from over. Washington's successors would face difficult decisions in the coming years, particularly as the political divisions between the Federalists and Democratic Republicans deepened. The rise of political parties and the growing tensions between the factions would dominate the early years of the 19th century, and Washington's warnings about factionalism and foreign entanglements would become even more relevant. In many ways, Washington's farewell address was a guide for future generations, an admonition to avoid the dangers of political division and foreign influence, and a reminder of the principles that had guided the nation to its present state. Washington's leadership had ensured that the United States would remain a republic, but his retirement marked the beginning of a new era, one in which the nation would have to navigate the complexities of political rivalry, international diplomacy, and the pursuit of national greatness. As Washington left office, He did so with a sense of accomplishment and peace. He had built a nation, not just in terms of physical borders, but in the hearts and minds of its people. He had been the indispensable leader during the Revolution and had steered the country through its most difficult early years. His commitment to Republican ideals, his sense of honor, and his refusal to seek power for its own sake would continue to resonate long after he had left the political scene. The United States, under Washington's leadership, had been forged into something stronger and more enduring than it might have been otherwise. A republic that, despite its flaws and divisions, had the potential to grow into one of the greatest nations in history. By the time George Washington handed over the reins of power to his successor, the United States was a very different nation than it had been when he first took office. The nation had gone from a newly independent collection of colonies to a fledgling republic, still finding its footing on the world stage, but with a growing sense of identity and purpose. Washington's departure from the presidency left a vacuum, and it marked the end of an era, one in which the nation had been shaped by his vision and leadership. The transition from Washington's leadership to that of his successors would prove to be a defining moment in American history, as the country moved into its next phase of development and faced new challenges both at home and abroad. Washington's decision to retire after 2 terms was a crucial moment in the history of the Republic. It solidified the precedent for the peaceful transfer of power, which would become a cornerstone of American democracy. Washington's willingness to step down, despite his immense popularity and the power that came with the office, demonstrated his commitment to the Republican ideals on which the country had been founded. He understood that no individual, however revered, should hold unchecked power, and his voluntary departure ensured that the United States would not fall into the hands of a monarch or a dictator. Washington's legacy, in this sense, was not just in what he had accomplished, but in how he had set the stage for the nation to grow and mature beyond his own influence. When Washington left office, the political environment in the United States had changed significantly. The first 2 terms of his presidency had seen the rise of political factions, with the Federalists and Democratic Republicans at the forefront of the growing political divide. The Federalists, led by figures like Alexander Hamilton, favored a strong central government, a robust economy, and a strong military. They believed that a strong federal government was essential for the nation's stability and future success. The Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, on the other hand, were wary of centralized power and emphasized the importance of states' rights and a more agrarian-based economy. The differences between the 2 factions were not just policy differences. They were philosophical differences that spoke to the heart of what kind of nation the United States would become. The Federalists believed that the country's future lay in commerce, industry, and a powerful central government, while the Democratic Republicans believed that the nation should remain rooted in its agrarian past, with a decentralized government that would allow for more direct control by the people. These differences became more pronounced after Washington's departure, and they would shape the future of American politics for many years to come. In the years following Washington's retirement, the country was faced with a number of challenges, both internal and external. One of the most pressing issues was the country's financial system. Washington had worked closely with his Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, to establish a strong national bank, a public credit system, and a tariff system to raise revenue. These measures were designed to stabilize the nation's economy and establish its financial credibility on the world stage. However, the financial system that Washington and Hamilton had put in place was still fragile, and it faced significant opposition, particularly from the Democratic Republicans, who believed that a national bank was unconstitutional and that it concentrated too much power in the hands of the federal government. The financial system was not the only challenge the country faced in the post-Washington years. The United States was also grappling with questions about its place in the world. Washington had established a policy of neutrality in foreign affairs, seeking to avoid entangling alliances and to keep the United States out of European conflicts. This policy was crucial in the early years of the Republic, as the United States was still a weak nation with a small military and limited international influence. However, after Washington left office, the question of how to engage with the world became more pressing. The French Revolution, which had begun in 1789, had escalated into a bloody conflict, and the United States found itself torn between supporting France, which had been an ally during the Revolutionary War, and maintaining neutrality. The political divisions that had been growing during Washington's presidency only deepened after his departure. The Federalists under President John Adams continued to push for a strong central government and closer ties with Britain, while the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, favored a more pro-French stance and a more limited role for the federal government. These divisions culminated in the XYZ affair, a diplomatic scandal in which French diplomats demanded bribes from American representatives, leading to an undeclared naval war between the United States and France. This conflict, known as the Quasi-War, further polarized the nation and exposed the deepening divisions between the Federalists and Democratic Republicans. The issues of foreign policy and political division were compounded by the internal struggles the United States faced during this period. The country was still grappling with the legacy of slavery, which was a deeply entrenched institution in the southern states. The question of whether or not to allow the expansion of slavery into new territories was a contentious issue that would continue to divide the nation for decades to come. Additionally, the nation's western frontier was still in a state of flux. Native American tribes were resisting American expansion into their lands, and the government was forced to confront the question of how to deal with these indigenous nations. In the midst of these challenges, the election of 1800 marked a significant turning point in American history. The election pitted the incumbent Federalist, President John Adams, against the Democratic-Republican challenger, Thomas Jefferson. The election was bitterly contested and marked by fierce partisan rhetoric. It was also notable for the fact that it was the first peaceful transfer of power from one political party to another in the history of the United States. Jefferson's victory in the election signaled the triumph of the Democratic Republicans and the decline of the Federalist Party. Jefferson's presidency marked the beginning of a new chapter in the history of the United States. While his administration faced many of the same challenges that Washington had dealt with, including questions of national unity, foreign relations, and the financial system, Jefferson brought a new perspective to the presidency. He was a staunch believer in states' rights and sought to reduce the power of the federal government. Jefferson's election also marked the beginning of the rise of the two-party system in American politics, with the Federalists slowly fading from power and the Democratic Republicans solidifying their control of the government. Despite the challenges of the post-Washington years, the United States continued to grow and mature as a nation. Washington's leadership had provided a solid foundation for the Republic, and his decision to retire from public life had set a precedent that would shape the country's future. However, the divisions that had emerged during his presidency would continue to play a significant role in shaping the course of American politics. The rise of political parties, the challenges of foreign relations, and the struggles over slavery and territorial expansion would dominate the nation's political landscape for many years to come. Washington's legacy, though, was undeniable. He had helped guide the United States through its most precarious years, establishing the principles of Republican government and setting the stage for the nation's future success. His leadership had been defined by a commitment to the ideals of liberty, unity, and the preservation of the Republic. Washington's decision to step down from the presidency was a testament to his understanding of the importance of Republican government and the dangers of concentrated power. His leadership had laid the groundwork for the country's future success, and his legacy would continue to shape the United States for generations to come. As the years passed following George Washington's retirement from the presidency, the United States faced a rapidly changing political and international landscape. Washington had helped to establish the foundation of a young republic, but with his departure, the nation entered a new era. The political divisions that had been emerging during Washington's second term began to deepen, setting the stage for the first real test of the nation's political system. Washington's decision to step down after 2 terms was a crucial precedent in American history. Yet the challenges that awaited the country in the post-Washington years would reveal just how fragile the early republic truly was. The Federalists, under President John Adams, were now in power, but their hold on the government was shaky at best. The election of 1796 had been closely contested, with Adams narrowly defeating his opponent, Thomas Jefferson, who would go on to become vice president. However, despite Adams' victory, the divisions between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans were already glaring. The political landscape was becoming increasingly polarized, and the once unified front that had existed during the Revolutionary War was beginning to fray. The central issue that divided the two parties was the question of a nation's role in the world. The Federalists, led by figures like Hamilton, were keen to align the United States with Britain, seeing it as the more stable and prosperous nation with whom to forge lasting ties. The Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson, believed the United States should remain aligned with France, their revolutionary ally. The conflict between Britain and France, which had been raging for years, now presented the United States with a dilemma. Both European powers were trying to draw the young republic into their respective conflicts, and Washington's policy of neutrality was increasingly difficult to maintain. Under Adams' leadership, the United States found itself drawn into a tense diplomatic struggle with France. In the wake of the French Revolution and the subsequent rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, the relationship between France and the United States had grown strained. French privateers had been seizing American ships in the Caribbean, and the French government was angry over what it saw as America's tilt toward Britain. Adams, who had inherited Washington's policy of neutrality, was confronted with the threat of war and was faced with the challenge of maintaining peace in a volatile international environment. The crisis with France, known as the XYZ affair, was the catalyst for the first major foreign policy test of the young nation. In 1797, President Adams sent a diplomatic mission to Paris to negotiate a resolution with the French government. However, when the American diplomats arrived, they were met by French agents who demanded bribes in exchange for negotiations. This insult, known as the XYZ affair, enraged the American public and led to widespread calls for war with France. The Federalists, who were already sympathetic to Britain, seized on the national outrage to build support for military action. However, Adams, despite pressure from his own party, resisted calls for war. Instead, he pursued a policy of diplomacy and negotiated an uneasy peace with France in 1800. The Treaty of Mortefontaine ended the hostilities between the two nations, but it also revealed the deepening divisions within the United States. Adams' decision to avoid war, though ultimately preserving the nation's peace, angered many within his own party, particularly the more hawkish Federalists. They saw his actions as a failure to protect American interests and as a sign of weakness. This decision played a key role in the demise of Adams' political career and the end of Federalist dominance in American politics. While Adams' leadership was characterized by cautious diplomacy in foreign affairs, it was also marked by internal strife. The Federalists, once united under Washington's leadership, began to fragment during Adams' presidency. This fragmentation was evident in the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, a series of laws that targeted immigrants and curbed free speech in an effort to suppress opposition to the Federalist government. These laws were deeply unpopular and widely seen as an overreach of government power, sparking protests and resistance, particularly from the Democratic Republicans. Jefferson and Madison, in particular, mounted a vigorous campaign against the Alien and Sedition Acts, arguing that they violated the Constitution and the principles of liberty that had been central to the American Revolution. The Alien and Sedition Acts further fueled the political divide, with many Americans seeing them as an attempt by the Federalists to consolidate power and suppress dissent. The laws, which allowed the president to deport foreigners and made it harder for immigrants to vote, were seen by many as an infringement on individual rights and freedoms. The Sedition Act, which criminalized the publication of false or scandalous statements against the government, was especially controversial. It was viewed as a direct attack on the First Amendment's guarantee of free speech, and it led to the arrest and prosecution of several prominent opposition figures, including Republican newspaper editors. As a result of these actions, the Democratic Republicans gained ground in the 1800 election, which marked the first peaceful transfer of power between political parties in the United States. Jefferson's victory in the election of 1800, also known as the Revolution of 1800, signaled the decline of the Federalist Party and the rise of the Democratic Republicans. Jefferson's campaign was built on promises of limited government, individual liberty, and a return to the ideals of the American Revolution. He championed the notion of agrarianism, advocating for a nation of independent farmers and a decentralized government that would leave most powers to the states. Jefferson's victory was not only a shift in political power, but also a shift in the direction of American governance. The Federalists had sought to build a strong, centralized government with an emphasis on commerce and industry. Jefferson, in contrast, believed that the country's strength lay in its agricultural roots and that the government should remain limited and decentralized. His vision of America was one of a republic of independent farmers, with a limited federal government that would not infringe on individual freedoms. The election of 1800 marked a turning point in American political history. It was the first time that power in the United States had passed peacefully from one party to another, setting a precedent for future transitions of power. The smooth transfer of authority from the Federalists to the Democratic Republicans was a testament to the resilience of the American political system and the strength of the Republican ideals on which the country had been founded. The election of 1800 demonstrated that, despite the political divisions that had arisen in the years following Washington's presidency, the United States was capable of adapting to change and maintaining the principles of self-government. Jefferson's presidency would bring new challenges, but it also marked a return to the principles that had guided Washington's administration. Jefferson sought to reverse many of the policies put in place by the Federalists, particularly those that centralized power in the federal government. One of his first actions as president was to reduce the size of the military, cut back on government spending, and repeal the Alien and Sedition Acts. He also focused on reducing the national debt, believing that a nation free from financial obligations was best equipped to remain independent and free from foreign influence. Jefferson's presidency also saw the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, a monumental event that doubled the size of the United States and opened up vast new territories for settlement and expansion. The acquisition of the Louisiana Territory from France was a significant turning point in American history, as it solidified the country's territorial claims and marked the beginning of its westward expansion. The purchase was not without controversy, as Jefferson had long been a strict constructionist who believed in interpreting the Constitution narrowly. However, the opportunity to acquire such a vast territory was too great to ignore, and the deal was struck, marking a major milestone in the expansion of the United States. In the years following George Washington's departure from the presidency, the United States found itself in a rapidly shifting political and international landscape. While Washington had laid the foundation for the young republic, his successor, John Adams, and the subsequent president, Thomas Jefferson, were faced with a series of challenges that would test the strength of the nation's institutions and the resilience of its democratic principles. The political climate, already tense and divided during Washington's time, only deepened after his retirement as the ideological divide between the Federalists and Democratic Republicans became more pronounced. Washington's voluntary retirement, a precedent that set the tone for future transitions of power, had marked a moment of unity for the country, but the years that followed were increasingly marked by factionalism, foreign entanglements, and a new stage of American political and territorial development. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson's election as president marked a dramatic shift in the political landscape of the United States. Jefferson's Democratic-Republican Party had successfully overcome the Federalists, who had controlled the government during Washington's presidency. This peaceful transfer of power, known as the Revolution of 1800, was a critical moment in American history, as it confirmed the strength of the Republic's institutions and the idea that leadership could change hands without resorting to violence or upheaval. It was a testament to the growing maturity of American democracy, even as the political divisions within the country continued to simmer. Jefferson's vision for the United States was in stark contrast to that of the Federalists. While the Federalists, led by figures like Alexander Hamilton, had advocated for a strong central government and an economy rooted in commerce and industry, Jefferson was deeply committed to the idea of a limited federal government. He believed that the strength of the nation lay in its agricultural base, with farmers as the backbone of American society. Jefferson envisioned a republic where individual liberties were safeguarded and the federal government's role was kept to a minimum. He believed that the best way to preserve freedom and self-governance was to ensure that power remained decentralized, with states retaining the authority to govern themselves. Jefferson's presidency, which began in 1801, was characterized by a commitment to reducing the influence of the federal government. One of his first acts was to cut the military budget and reduce the size of the standing army, reflecting his belief that the country should avoid foreign entanglements and focus on internal development. He also sought to reduce the national debt, which had grown under the previous administration, by cutting taxes and government spending. Jefferson believed that a nation free from debt would be better able to maintain its independence and avoid the influence of foreign powers. His fiscal policies reflected a desire to return to the ideals of the Revolution, where a limited government would allow citizens to live freely and without undue interference.